this is a vital debate that we're having tonight, Ciarán, and while there may be a sense of complacency that the issue of mortgage arrears has been dealt with, it certainly has not been, in my view. And while action is now being taken by the banks, it is a scattergun approach, in my view. They are getting it right in some cases. In other cases, they are not getting it right. And what I am witnessing in their approach to dealing with mortgage arrears is a distinct lack of consistency and a distinct lack of transparency. And if you look at the approach, for example, of the two-pillar banks when it comes to dealing with mortgage arrears, and we had further evidence of that today with the announcement by the Irish Mortgage Holders Organisation of over 1,300 long-term restructurings agreed between their clients who are customers of AIB and the bank in the past year, and up to 100 of those cases involved writing off mortgage debt, writing off part of the principal balance. You contrast that with Bank of Ireland, another pillar bank, also saved by the state, though in a healthier position and now in majority private ownership, and they have a completely different policy of no mortgage write-off under any circumstances. And so you have borrowers who are in similar circumstances being treated entirely differently depending on what bank they're with. And to me, that is fundamentally unfair. And it is an approach that we should not be standing over. The Code of Conduct of Mortgage Arrears is at the heart of this motion. That code was introduced back in 2010, and in general, it has served borrowers well in providing a rule book that lenders must abide by in dealing with people who have mortgage arrears. Now, that rule book was changed, I would say diluted, back in 2013 by the current government, when they allowed the banks to move within 30 days, legally move on people who are deemed to be non-cooperating. The banks had the power to deem people to be non-cooperating, and legal proceedings could issue within 30 days. The restriction on the number of contacts that the bank could make with the individual in arrears was lifted. So we went from a situation where there was a tight regime in place on the number of contacts to one where the banks are now able to contact people in arrears regularly, and the 12-month moratorium was removed and replaced with an 8-month moratorium. So you had a very significant dilution of borrower protections in the revised Code of Conduct, which was published in 2013. And it goes back to the point I made about the difference in the approach being adopted by different banks, and indeed sometimes within institutions, depending on who you're dealing with. And that is because they are not working to any common set of rules or any common guide in terms of how to work out individual mortgage arrears cases. Does anyone in this House know under what criteria a borrower in arrears might qualify for a write-off of mortgage debt? I don't know, because that criteria is not published. And equally, other banks are taking a completely different approach, a more hardline approach, may I say, which is resulting in a lot of deeply unfair situations developing, and that simply is not good enough. Because an essential element of fairness is consistency. People have to be treated consistently, and that is not happening at the moment. Now, there is movement. Deputy Barry is right. Some deals are being done. Some cases are being handled sympathetically, and I've been involved in some of them, and the outcomes have been fair, to my mind. But in other cases, it is like banging your head against a wall. And we're not making the progress that we should be making, because I cannot point to any document which requires the bank to deal with cases in a certain way, because ultimately the bank makes the final call. Even under the Mortgage Arrears Targets programme, which has resulted in a lot of activity, the bank decides essentially what a sustainable solution is. The definition of a sustainable solution to a mortgage arrears problem is set out towards the very back of that document, and it is the bank must satisfy itself that the solution it is offering to the individual in arrears is a sustainable one. So they are judge and jury, and they are a party to the transaction with a direct vested interest in a certain outcome being secured. And I stand by my assertion that the banks did indeed hijack the mortgage arrears targets programme by issuing thousands of threatening legal letters to borrowers already suffering a huge degree of stress and anxiety, and the number of repossessions is dramatically increasing. Let there be no mistake about it. I got some figures in Cork recently which were frightening. An ejectment civil bill, as you know, is a step in the process that may lead to repossession of the family home. In Cork Circuit Court, in the first 6 months of last year, there were 44 such bills. In the second half of last year, there were 246 civil ejectment bills, and in the first 6 months of this year, that had grown to 335 civil ejectment bills. They are scheduling additional court sittings in Cork to deal with the backlog of civil ejectment bill cases. That is the reality. So the rhetoric that we hear that the repossession of the family home is the last resort, should only happen in a tiny number of cases, is not being borne out in reality. The reality could not be further from that assertion. Extra court sittings being arranged, and that is a fact. Another issue I want to highlight, Cahir, is the issue of the interest rates being charged by Irish banks, because it is directly relevant to the debate on mortgage arrears. And the Minister will know this well, that the average rate being charged in the Eurozone today for somebody taking out a new mortgage to buy a home is 2.56%. Now, if you go onto the National Consumer Agency website here, itsyourmoney.ie, type in the criteria that you're looking for a loan of €200,000 to buy a house of €250,000, all of the rates being offered by the banks will come up, and they're close to 4.5%. Now, for an individual or a couple with a mortgage of €200,000, that means that an Irish borrower is paying about €4,000 more in interest every year than a typical borrower in the Eurozone. So when we hear that our banking system is fixed, that it's repaired, that it's meeting the needs of the economy, I'm sorry, I do not agree, because those rates are extortionate in a European context. The cost of funds for Irish banks today is about 1%. Where is the justification in charging 4.5% on a variable rate mortgage when the cost of funds for the bank is about 1%? Now, starting tomorrow, the Oireachtas Finance Committee will hold its hearings with the banks. Bank of Ireland are in first, and I will be challenging them on these issues because it is directly linked to the whole issue of mortgage arrears. And AIB made a preemptive move last week, which I welcome very much, reducing their rate by 0.25%. And I hope that the other banks follow suit and reduce their variable rates as well. Because what we are really lacking in this country is a competitive banking sector. In the UK, in the rest of Europe, there is a normal switcher mortgage market available, that if you are paying over the odds for your mortgage, you can apply to another bank and just move your mortgage to them. That's not happening here. We had less than 200 switcher mortgages in the first 6 months of this year. The banks really aren't open for that business. They don't want to hear of it. And the real test of AIB's move in reducing the rate will be if a customer of Ulster Bank or Bank of Ireland who's paying a higher rate knocks on the door of AIB and says, look, I'm in a healthy financial position, I've never missed a repayment, my loan to value is 60–70%, will you consider a mortgage application from me so that I can now avail of the lower interest rate? And that will be the real litmus test of whether or not the banks are genuine in being open for business, in creating a much more competitive environment, and that is something that the government needs to deal with. Back to the issue of the Code of Conduct on mortgage arrears. I'm sure the Minister is aware of this, that the Central Bank has not imposed a single sanction on banks in this country for failing to honour the mortgage arrears rulebook, despite evidence of breaches of the CCMA occurring. And those breaches have been confirmed by none other than the Governor of the Central Bank, Patrick Honohan. He confirmed as much before an Oireachtas committee hearing on the 30th of April this year, when he confirmed that they have found breaches of the Code of Conduct on mortgage arrears. And yet, not a single sanction has been imposed on banks for breaches of the CCMA. Now, I welcome the fact that the central bank is getting around to doing a proper test on the compliance of the banks in Ireland with the CCMA, because in my view there have been breaches, there continue to be breaches, and that issue needs to be dealt with. Minister, there is a commitment in the government's amendment to dealing with the issue of regulating third parties currently not regulated by the central bank who are holding mortgages, and that needs to be dealt with urgently. The legislation has been promised before the end of the year. It needs to happen because people are in a very exposed and vulnerable situation. If an issue arises with the non-compliance with the Code of Conduct and Mortgage Arrears, they have nowhere to turn. They cannot go to the Department of Finance, they can't turn to the central bank, nobody will listen to their case because these foreign-owned funds are not accountable to anyone in that sense of the word. The issue of the insolvency service and the failure, the abject failure, Minister, for that to be a real vehicle to deal with mortgage cases, mortgage arrears cases, has to be dealt with. You've had no more than a couple of dozen of individual mortgage cases being dealt with as part of the Insolvency Service of Ireland. Now, the government was forewarned about this, that this would happen, because the banks have been given a veto, and the banks have publicly said before the Oireachtas Finance Committee, a number of them, that they will exercise that veto if any insolvency arrangement is proposed that involves a haircut or a write-off in the mortgage balance. They have said that publicly, and they are honouring that, because that's what's happening. Deals are not being done. Now, there are a number of issues that need to be dealt with in terms of access to a personal insolvency practitioner, in terms of allowing people who have no net disposable income after taking into account the cost of living guidelines to make a contribution to an insolvency deal. Those people are currently locked out of the system, and that needs to be dealt with as well. So, I mean, 27 cases concluded where there has been a change to the mortgage arrangement through the Insolvency Service really is pathetic, to be honest with you. And you know, it is time to go back to the drawing board on that, because merely dropping the fees that the Insolvency Service itself is charging is not going to adequately address that issue. The mortgage to rent scheme needs to be revamped, Minister. It's not working. Again, a few dozen cases completed. Each of us as individual deputies are trying to help people to work their way through mortgage to rent. It's a bureaucratic nightmare. It's simply not working, and it is going to have to be completely revamped. I want to briefly touch on the central bank's proposed new mortgage deposit rules, and they are advocating a 20% deposit, which I have to say I believe is excessive. I believe it will result in social engineering. It will mean that home ownership is going to be beyond a lot of people, particularly people from certain socio-economic backgrounds. That's not fair. People who have parents with the financial means to provide a deposit will be able to get around this rule, and to my way of thinking, a deposit of 10 to 12% is more reasonable. I think it's achievable. I think it's reasonable. There is a requirement for a minimum deposit. I accept that. I personally believe that 20% is excessive. Now, finally, turning to the actual mortgage arrears stats, and they are coming down. And that's to be welcomed. But we do have to look at these numbers with a degree of caution and a degree of scepticism. The overall numbers are coming down, but as far as I can see, the most popular solution is arrears capitalisation. We've had 25,700 arrears capitalisation cases. Now, once the arrears have been capitalised and the new repayment method is honoured, then they come out of the arrears statistics. So it's difficult to know whether or not the underlying trend is of a significant reduction. I hope it is, but arrears capitalisation has accounted for 25.2% of the solutions. We know from the stats published by the Central Bank, it is one of the least successful solutions, with only 66.8% of them being honoured, the terms of them being met. So that issue needs to be dealt with. And also, when you look at the underlying stats, the issue of long-term arrears, those in arrears of over 720 days, are increasing. 31,000, then to 33,000, 35,000, and now to 37,000 in the last quarter. And clearly what is happening there, the solution for those people is to end up in the circuit court, as I outlined earlier on, which is happening in Cork and elsewhere around the country. And there is a need to be much more imaginative, such as New Beginning have proposed, to deal with that issue and to, insofar as possible, keep the family home for the vast majority of them.